So, thank you very much it is a great pleasure for me to be here and to address you today. The the topic of my presentation, public debt in advanced and emerging economies. Its potential benefits, the potential benefits of public debt, but also the risks that are associated with an excessive accumulation of public debt in both advanced economies, something that I have in both advanced and emerging economies, is something that I've worked quite a lot over the last several years. Public debt has increased since very rapidly since 2008, especially in the richest part of the world, in what we at the IMF call advanced economies, the group of 35 largest, richest countries. But there have also been increases that we will see in emerging economies. In my presentation today, I will in my presentation, I will first review the history of public debt in both advanced and emerging economies. And then I will move to what are the views of economists about public debt, why economists are worried about public debt. We will then look at the current public debt outlook, where is public debt in both advanced and emerging economies. And finally, we will discuss a bit what to do, what policymakers should do to address the problem. So let's start with a short history of public debt in the world. First of all, what is public debt? Public debt is the amount of money that the government borrows from households, from banks, from the rest of the world. By amount of money, by government, I mean not just the central government of a country, but also subnational governments. In a federal state like India, the states also borrow. In the United States, it's not only the federal government that borrows, it is also the states, and it is also the municipalities. So when we talk about public debt, we mean the total amount of debt that these institutions borrow. For simplicity, in my presentation, I will often refer to the government as being the entity that borrows, but this is a simplification. What I really mean, it's all the governments of a certain country, which means the central government, but also the state governments and the local governments. So this is the definition of public debt, and the government borrows every year, every month, if there is an imbalance between its revenues, essentially taxes, and its spending. This imbalance is called the fiscal deficit, and this generates public debt. The sum of the deficit in every year is what it generates public debt. You borrow in 1 year, it's like a household, you borrow in 1 year, and as you borrow, your debt goes up. In a historical perspective, public debt is something that is relatively new. There is an interesting book called Debt, the First 5,000 Years. It's a book by David Graeber. It's mostly about private debt. In an historical perspective, in the last 5,000 years, we see that private debt arising 5,000 years ago. Public debt is relatively recent, as also underscored by, for example, Niall Ferguson, a historian who has looked into this and have seen and has argued that public debt is something that has been born just a few centuries ago. But it's been rising it can grow very fast, and it rises very fast, typically in periods of war, with some important exceptions. So let's look at some figures. I'm going to show you just the last 115 years. This is the behavior of public debt to GDP ratio is the public debt to GDP ratio for advanced economies. So we start with the richest countries. Public debt is measured in this chart as a ratio to GDP. So as a ratio of the income that every year a certain country produces. You don't see single countries here, you see the average for the advanced economies, or more specifically for the largest, the G20 advanced economies. Why do people measure public debt in relation to GDP? Essentially because GDP is the source of potential revenues that the government can raise to pay the interest on its debt and potentially to repay its debt. So it gives you, it's important to see what is the size of debt compared to the size of the economy, because the size of the economy tells you how easy it will be for the government to pay back its debt. So let's look at this chart more closely. Debt was reached some important historical peaks on the occasion of the two world wars. Wars implies that governments have to borrow heavily to finance their debt, and this is exactly what happened in the course of the First World War and the Second World War. There was also a small increase in debt during the Great Recession. It's relatively small compared to the increase in debt on the occasion of the First and the Second World War. The real exception to the rule that public debt increases when there are wars really comes from the last 30 years. As you can see, in advanced economies, there was a steady increase in public debt starting in the middle of the 1970s, which was mostly driven to the fact that the social security systems and the health care systems of many advanced countries was being reformed, and taxes were not raised in an equal amount to finance the increased deficit. And then, as you can see, there is a pretty large surge in public debt, in the public debt to GDP ratio, starting in 2007, as fiscal policy was used actively by governments to support economic activity after the 2008-2009 financial crisis. Now let's look at emerging markets. So now we are looking at the largest emerging markets. This chart tells you a few important things. First of all, public debt in emerging markets has typically been lower than public debt in advanced economies. This does not mean, however, that it was in a way less dangerous, because what economists call the level of tolerance of public debt in emerging economies is much lower than in advanced economies, for a number of reasons. Because financial markets are less developed, because domestic financial markets and the availability of domestic savings is less developed, and consequently because many emerging markets have been borrowed a lot of money from abroad. And external public debt is more dangerous than domestic public debt, simply because when there are troubles in the government paper, in the government securities markets, foreigners are the first one to run away. So even if debt in emerging economy has on average been lower than in public debt in advanced economies, we know that public debt has been quite a problem in many emerging markets, and as we will see more in detail, has led to crisis in many to financial crisis in many emerging markets. But let's first see more closely at why economists believe that too much public debt is a problem. I mentioned the fact that too much public debt can lead and has led in emerging markets to financial crisis. But the first reason why if we look at economic history, of the history of economic thought, why economists have started worrying about public debt is a different one. If we go back to the birth of economics in the 18th centuries, we find that economists were worried, first of all, about the effect that a lot of public debt would have on the growth of a country. They used to see public debt as a sort of very heavy weight on the shoulders of the economy that prevented the growth. If we look, for example, to the writings of Adam Smith, or even before Adam Smith, philosophers like David Hume, or later economists like John Stuart Mill, we go now to the 19th century, the main reason why these people were worried about public debt is that they said high public debt requires the government to levy very high taxes to finance the payment of interest rates on public debt. And heavy taxes are bad for enterprises. They lead entrepreneurs, firms to invest abroad rather than domestically. That's the main reason why public debt is bad. A similar reason was used in more recent periods to explain again why high public debt is bad for growth. Yes, it implies very high taxes, not just on enterprises, also on labor, on workers. Now, if we go back to the period in which these guys wrote, there was no personal income tax. When the personal income tax was introduced later on, economists started worrying about the impact that high taxation would have on the labor supply, for example. You are taxed, you prefer to stay home and not to work, and therefore there is less growth in the economy. There is another very important channel why too much public debt involves lower growth. Too much public debt means that the government has to borrow from the private sector to finance the payment of interest and to repay its debt. And this leads to higher real interest rates because the government borrows quite a lot, but the amount of saving is attracted by the government. There is less savings that goes to finance private investment, and this also slows down growth. Now, this is the theory about why high public debt leads to lower growth. But what is empirical analysis is telling us about the effect of high public debt on growth? There have been, in the last few years, several studies, several statistical and econometric studies looking at why high public debt leads to lower medium-term potential growth. And with a few exceptions, they all conclude that yes, there is a clearly identifiable, statistically identifiable link between high public debt and growth, and that the direction goes from high public debt to lower growth and not vice versa. There may be effects from low growth into high public debt, because, for example, if there is low growth, there are less taxation revenues from the government that decline or do not rise as fast as they would if growth were higher. But statistically, it has been proved by most of these studies that the line of causality goes from high public debt towards lower growth. I will just show you the effects, the results of one econometric study that was done while I was head of the Fiscal Affairs Department of the IMF. And it was a study that refers both to advanced economies and emerging economies. But I will show you just the result. Sorry, this is what these three guys said, but I already said it. Let's move to the next one. This is based on that study, and for the advanced economies only, the effect of high public debt on growth. This study concludes that if a country moves from a debt to GDP ratio, a public debt to GDP ratio of 60% to a public debt to GDP ratio of 120%, growth declines. The line should actually be from top to down, but it's inverted. The scale is inverted, so growth declines by about 1 percentage point. So for an increase in the public debt to GDP ratio by 60 percentage points, growth declines 1%. Now, 1% may not seem to be large to you, but the effect on income is cumulative. So after 20 years of growth that is lowered by 1%, you get a lower level of GDP that is more than 20%. If you want to look at this from another point of view, a 1% lower growth for an advanced economy is a lot. The IMF is currently projected that for advanced economy will grow over the next 5 years on average by 2%. So 1%, if public debt were lower in advanced economy, growth could be 1 percentage point higher. So not 2%, but 3% over several years. It's not a minor effect. There is a second reason why high public debt is regarded to be problematic, and the reason is that high public debt, as I already mentioned, may cause a financial crisis in the government securities market. It can cause a confidence crisis, more specifically. What is a confidence crisis? Well, investors may simply be afraid that when public debt is high with respect to GDP, the government will simply decide not to pay. Now, as we know, high public debt require higher taxes to finance the payment of interest or to lower the public debt level. And paying taxes or cutting spending as that's an alternative solution. The government can cut spending, spend less rather than raising taxes. Neither of these two things is something that voters like very much. So the government may simply decide that in order to avoid keeping taxes high, in order to avoid cutting spending, it may simply decide not to pay back the investors. And because of this, investors are afraid and they don't invest, they stop investing in the government securities market. Now, if initially investors stop investing in government securities, the interest rates on government paper will go up. But as the interest rate on government paper goes up, on government bonds goes up, the interest rate, the government, it will be even more difficult for the government to pay interest on its debt, and at one point the interest rate reaches a point in which the investors are simply not willing to invest in a government securities market. And that's when there is a problem not only for the government but also for the whole economy, because when the government cannot borrow, very quickly this extends also to the private sector, because the government is the ultimate support of the economy. If the government cannot borrow, then people become afraid, particularly foreign markets become afraid even to lend to the private sector, and this leads to a sudden stop of the economy. We have seen several countries hit by crises of this sort in the government securities market. Countries like Greece, Portugal, Ireland in 2010, 2011. If we look at emerging economies, we see Mexico in 1994. We see Argentina in 2001, 2002. We see Russia. Russia had to default actually on its public debt in 1999. These are things that can have a very severe effects on economic activity. Key question is at what point does public debt become so high as to potentially cause a confidence crisis? Now, a lot of statistical work has been done on this issue, and it is clear that several factors affect. There is no magic number, but several factors affect the level to which public debt becomes dangerous, including, as I mentioned, the degree of development of financial markets, therefore whether debt is domestic or foreign, or the composition of the currency, the denomination of debt. So there are several factors, so it's difficult to generalize, but it is useful to have some reference number, and these are the reference numbers that are used by the IMF to identify whether there is a risk, a potential risk of a crisis, or at least whether there is a need to look into the issue of public debt further. The thresholds are different. There are 85% of GDP for advanced economies. It is 70% of GDP for emerging economies. So, these are the two concerns of why economists are worried when there is too much public debt, lower potential growth, and the risk of an economic crisis, which could actually have a huge an impact effect, very strong also on potential growth. But in spite of these worries, the attitude of economists towards public debt changed significantly during the 1930s as a result of the increased influence of this guy. You may have heard about him, Keynes, one of probably the most influential economists of the last 150 years. Keynes argued that there are cases in which the private sector, enterprises, houses, the private sector of an economy simply does not generate enough demand for goods and services to allow the economy to employ everybody that wishes to work. You know that enterprises produce if they believe that they can sell, and sometimes the demand, Keynes argued, the demand for goods and services of enterprises is not large enough. In these conditions, there is a need for the government to step in and increase its spending, particularly investment spending, but more general spending to support economic activity. Keynes had great influence on modern economic theory, and its influence has been in a way revived again over the last few years as a result of the global economic crisis that affected the global economy in 2008, 2009. And it was taught in that period and in these following years, and even now, that the world is suffering from a lack of demand for goods and services, which prevents employment to be sufficiently increased. Fiscal policy has, since 2008, been used very actively to support economic activity. And the IMF has also done something that was unusual for, let's say, a relatively conservative institution like the IMF. The IMF has recommended expanding public spending over the last few years in a number of countries to support economic activity. So Keynes was never too much interested on the issue of public debt. He was arguing that there was a need for more spending, but he did not focus, and there is a lot of debate on how worried Keynes was about the issue of public debt. He did not really write too much about this. But assuming that public debt is a problem, then there is a third reason why high public debt can be problematic. And the reason is that if public debt is high, the government cannot increase spending or cut taxation because it would accumulate an excessive amount, a further increase. There will be a further increase in public debt. So if that is already high, it becomes difficult to raise it further to support economic activity when there is a need to support economic activity. That is the reason why a country like Italy, my country, in 2008, 2009, could not increase its deficit and its debt very rapidly to support economic activity, like other countries instead did, like the United States did, or the United Kingdom did, because it was already overburdened with a lot of debt. So this is what I wanted to tell you about why economists are worried about high public debt. Let's now look at the numbers, how in practice public debt is, how high public debt is across countries. So let's look at the current outlook, the current public debt situation. This is a list of advanced economies by the size of their public debt to GDP ratio. This looks at the data at the end of 2004. the list has not changed dramatically over the last few years, over the last year. On top, I hope you can read it, you find countries like Japan, Greece, Italy, then you have Portugal, Ireland, Cyprus. Most of these countries with high debt were hit by an economic crisis. Greece, Portugal, Ireland, Cyprus. They had to come to the IMF to borrow money because they couldn't finance themselves anymore on the market. We are in that situation of confidence crisis that I described earlier. Italy got very close to this. Italy did not have to come to the IMF, so these countries had to the IMF. Italy did not, but was very close to coming to the IMF. The real exception is Japan. Japan is the country with the highest public debt to GDP ratio, and it did not have to come to the IMF. It never had to come to the IMF in several decades. And so why wonders why is Japan is an exception? Japan is an exception to a large extent because most of its debt, almost 95% of its debt is held domestically. So there is less of a risk of a confidence crisis. As I was mentioning to you, when there is a crisis, it's the foreigners who move away from the country more rapidly. But this does not mean that Japan is not suffering from the high level of its public debt. Perhaps the other channel through which high public debt affects the economy is operating for Japan, and is the challenge that classical economists were initially worried with, that the high public debt would imply over the medium term lower growth, indeed lower GDP growth. Indeed, if we look at this other chart, we see that Japan had one of the lowest increases in its GDP over the last 25 years. You also see Italy with the lowest increase of all these advanced countries. You see there, and Italy, as I mentioned, is also a country with a very high public debt to GDP ratios. How about emerging economies? Emerging economies, here I have plotted the 10 emerging economies with the largest public debt to GDP ratio. On top, you find Ukraine, a country with which had to borrow from the IMF because it had problems in financing itself on the market. Among these countries, you also find Hungary, Pakistan, Sri Lanka. These are all countries that in the last few years had to borrow from the IMF because they had difficulties in financing themselves on the market. You also find Brazil, one of the largest emerging economies, which is not borrowing from the IMF, but is currently undergoing a difficult economic phase and is tightening its fiscal policy to strengthen its fiscal credibility. And then you have India here. India, which is also in the process of strengthening its fiscal accounts, although in a more gradual way than Brazil. India is not suffering from many problems related to public debt, but I would like to show you this other chart. India is these are the same countries that you have in the other chart, so countries with high public debt. You see that India has a negative increase in public debt over the last few years. So among these countries, it's one of the few that managed to reduce its public debt to GDP ratio. This is not a trivial observation because there is also empirical evidence that given the same amount of public debt, if public debt is declining, then the drawbacks of high public debt become much less severe. So if you are in the process of a significant decline in your public debt to GDP ratio, you are in a way protected for a while, even if you have a relatively high public debt to GDP ratio. Before turning to the last part of my presentation, I want to talk, which is about the solution to high public debt. I wanted to show you another chart that relates to what I call hidden public debt. Sorry, before I do that, this is the, okay, yes, hidden public debt. What is hidden public debt? You know that all countries have in place social security systems, pension systems, and they also have, there is typically also a public health care systems. Now, because of population aging, the population of the world is getting older. Over the last 10, 20, 30, 40 years, the world is going to see a very large increase at current legislation, both in pension and healthcare spending. So the government, in a way, is committed now to pay pensions, to pay pensioners future pension quite a lot of money, and to pay people for healthcare systems over the next decade. This quite a lot of money. This will go up simply because of population aging, and as far as healthcare is concerned, also because of technological changes in the healthcare system. So there is a projected increase in this spending, and this chart tells you country by country for both advanced economies and emerging economies the net present value of these pension and healthcare spending increases. So the sum essentially is the sum of these increases that will occur over the next 35 years. And if you accumulate this is not debt that is already recorded. That's why I call it hidden debt, but it's something that, unless something is done about it, will hit the public finances over the next decade. And we're talking about a very large number. For many countries, actually for most countries, even higher than the amount, the observable amount of debt, financial debt. For a country like the United States, for example, you see that this hidden debt is equal to 200% of GDP, while its recorded debt is about 105% of 110% of GDP. Now, this hidden debt is not the same as financial debt for a number of reasons. The main one is that while financial debt matures, expires every month, every quarter, every year, this is not this kind of debt is hidden, is not circulating through bonds or securities that get to maturity and need to be renewed. So it puts much less pressure, immediate pressure, on the fiscal accounts, but it's something that cannot be forgotten and needs to be taken into account. So, to sum up, public debt is very high in advanced economies. It is still, as we have seen, much lower in emerging economies, but in some emerging economies remains quite high. I showed you some of these emerging economies. At present, many countries do not really feel the burden of this, the increased burden of this public debt, because interest rates are currently quite low, as a result of very expansionary monetary policies needed to support economic activity, including in the United States, including in Europe. But interest rates have started rising in the United States and will sooner or later start rising also in other countries. So there will be, when this occurs, an increasing pressure on the fiscal accounts coming from the level of high public debt. And the question, what can be done to lower, what countries do to lower their debt to GDP ratio, which is the last part of my presentation. Now, what are the options? We need, first of all, to realize that while public debt is problematic, for example, I mentioned that high public debt requires keeping taxes higher to finance interest payments, the cure could be even worse than the disease. I may have a lot of public debt, but if to lower it, I have to raise taxes even more, then the cure may be even worse than the disease itself. I may be fat, and that's bad. Being fat is can create problems to my health. But if I go on a diet, and if the diet is very harsh, I may even have larger problems, and I may decide to remain fat. So that because the cure to high public debt may be even worse than the disease, economists and governments have been looking into sort of shortcuts to reduce public debt. And in economic history, the most important shortcut to reduce public debt is printing money. In history, governments used to print money directly, and if you print money, with that money you can pay back your public debt. With that money you can finance new public spending. In modern economies, governments do not print money themselves. They have central banks that print money, and normally the central bank is owned or controlled by the government. So the government may simply ask the central bank to print more money. The government borrows the money from the central bank. With that money, it pays back public debt, it pays interest on debt, it pays for new public spending. The government borrows from the central bank, and sometimes it usually pays an interest to the central bank, but because the profits of the central banks are returned at the end of the year to the government, because the government is the owner of the central bank, usually any money that is printed by the central bank, it is as if it were printed directly by the government. So why don't governments simply finance themselves by printing money? And the reason is that this typically leads to inflation. If there is too much money in the economy, sooner or later people start regarding banknotes, money, for what they actually are, simply a piece of paper. A piece of paper that can lose its value over time. Historically, the printing of money to finance the government has been the main reason behind a lot of inflation. Inflation is good for the government. It's good that the government gets money, it can spend it without raising its debt. It's also good because a lot of inflation erodes the value in real terms of public debt. The public debt that is worth 100 today will be worth also 100 in 1 year, but if there is inflation, 100 in 1 year is less in real terms than 100 today. And so the government also benefits from inflation for this, but this is like a tax, and it has the same drawbacks of other taxes. High inflation can also affect economic activity quite a lot. So although in theory inflation is a possible solution to high public debt, is not a particularly useful solution. It can be, the printing of money can be a solution in the short run. It allows the deficit, it allows a more gradual pace of fiscal adjustment, which is exactly what is happening now in countries like the United States, the United Kingdom, where the central bank has actually financed quite a lot the government, but at the same time fiscal adjustment is proceeding. Because if fiscal adjustment were not proceeding, it would sooner or later be clear to everybody that the debt, public debt, is being monetized, and this will lead to an inflation outburst. Second, but in general, apart from this buying time that the printing money may allow you, inflation is not a great solution. Second solution is debt repudiation, actually what markets are afraid of. Simply, the government can simply decide not to pay back its debt. And this is quite a frequent solution. Ken Rogoff and Carmen Reinhardt, in their book, This Time is Different, 800 Years of Financial Folly, have found that over the last 200 and since the beginning of the 19th century, since 1800, there have been 320 cases of public debt restructuring. So the government decides either not to pay, or to pay at a lower interest rate, or to pay at a longer maturity. There have been 320 cases of this sort within the 66 countries considered in their sample. So that restructuring is definitely a solution, but it has its own costs. First of all, a country that decides to repudiate its debt and to repay the lenders at different terms loses obviously its part of its reputation of financial market. The next time that a country that has defaulted on its public debt goes back to the market, it will pay a larger interest rates. The second, if a larger share of public debt is held domestically, then a debt repudiation is like any other tax. It's also a tax. Many people believe that government should default on their public debt because this would avoid fiscal tightening, it would avoid raising taxes or cutting spending. But defaulting on public debt is like a tax. Instead of taxing labor, you decide to tax a certain type of wealth. You tax the bond holders. So default is not an alternative to taxation. It's a specific kind of taxation if your debt is held domestically. If, like the cases of default on public debt of the 1980s, Latin America in the 1980s, where debt were held mostly by North American banks, then you default on public debt and there are no spillover effects on your economy. But if your debt is mostly domestic, then you're taxing. It's another form of taxing your own people. So it is not a surprise that of the 320 cases of debt repudiation that I mentioned earlier, only 70 relate to domestic debt. Let me briefly mention a third possible shortcut to public debt reduction, that is privatizing. The government sells its asset. This is in principle a very good solution. It happens, however, that in most countries, particularly most advanced countries with high public debt, they don't have enough financial enough financial or real assets to sell. And so, in principle, it would be a nice solution, but in practice, it has a limited impact. So, what is the right solution? The right solution must come from a combination of high economic growth and some degree of fiscal adjustment, some degree of fiscal austerity. Let's first talk about economic growth. To give you an idea of how powerful economic growth is in lowering public debt, I'll show you this short simulation. Sorry, I don't have a simulation, but I'll tell you in words. Consider a country that has a public debt to GDP ratio of 130%. If a country, and assume a taxation rate of about 40%. If a country like this increases its growth by just 1%, and saves all the revenues for the government coming from higher growth, these countries, after 10 years, will have lowered its public debt to GDP ratio by 30 percentage points, and by just 15 years, it would have lowered its public debt to GDP ratio by 60 percentage points. So, after 15 years of higher growth, 1% more per year, this country, instead of having a debt to GDP ratio of 130%, would have a public debt to GDP ratio of 70%, major difference. This occurs for two reasons. First, because higher growth implies more revenues for the government, and more revenues for the government allow you to pay back your debt. The second reason is that, of course, we measure public debt as a ratio to GDP, and if GDP grows more rapidly, the debt to GDP ratio declines also more rapidly. Note, however, that these two forces, the increase in revenues and the increase in the denominator, the most powerful one by far is the first one. So if growth increases and you save the additional revenues, you have a faster decline in the debt to GDP ratio. If you increase growth but you spend all the additional revenues, the public debt to GDP ratio will decline anyway because of the denominator effect, but the impact will be much slower. with respect to the experiment I mentioned earlier, after 10 years, the debt to GDP ratio, if you spend all the revenues that increase when there is more growth, the debt to GDP ratio after 10 years will be lower just by 11 percentage points, not 30, and after 15 years it will be lower by 17 percentage points, not 60 percentage points. So that means that growth works, but it works much more if it is coupled with some degree of fiscal austerity. In particular, in the example I gave you, you don't spend the additional revenues, or at least part of the additional revenues that emerge from when growth is higher. So let's come to the last point. You need some degree of fiscal austerity. You need to avoid an increase in spending that is too high. In some countries, you need to raise taxation. But my main point is that how much austerity will be needed depends, fiscal austerity will be needed, depends, is different from country to countries, but in general, not a lot of fiscal austerity will be needed in many of the countries that have now high public debt. Sorry, let me, okay, no, we'll get to this in a moment. Take, for example, my country, Italy. Italy has a debt to GDP ratio of 130%. It has a deficit, an imbalance between revenues and spending of 2.4% of GDP. What is needed for Italy to put the debt to GDP ratio on a downward sloping trend is essentially to run a balanced budget for a number of years. Running a balanced budget, how do you get from a deficit of 2.4% of GDP to a balanced budget, so to a deficit for zero? In the case of Italy, Italy will need to freeze public spending in real terms for 3 years. Now, freezing real spending means, in real terms, means that you don't cut spending. You just avoid increasing spending in real terms. The population will have the same amount per capita, everybody will have the same amount of real services, but you have to avoid an increase in this for 3 years. Now, if Italy did this in 3 years, because of higher growth in the next 3 years and because of higher revenues, if these revenues will be saved, the balance could be budgeted within 3 years. Then it will be a matter of keeping it balanced for a number of years. The debt to GDP ratio will start declining. I don't see this kind of fiscal austerity as particularly harsh for a country like Italy. But the measures that will be needed the specific measures that will be needed are different across countries. The IMF has given a recommendation on how to implement growth-friendly fiscal adjustments. So a fiscal adjustment that were consistent with maintaining a reasonable degree of economic growth. It has recommended to avoid cuts in critical items like public investment and education, and instead it has recommended to target non-productive spending, public waste in a way. The IMF has recommended also avoiding tax increases that affect potential growth too much. Now, what are the tax increases that affect growth too much? First of all, taxing labor is not a great idea. It discourages the supply of labor by workers. The form of taxation that is less that affecting economic growth less is taxation on real estate. So the fund has recommended raising real estate taxation in a number of countries. Some advanced economies like the United States and Japan also have room to raise taxation on energy. Now, this is a very important issue from a different point of view, from the point of view of pollution and fighting global warming. Many countries do not tax emissions of CO2 enough. Two of them are the United States and Japan. The IMF has recommended the United States and Japan to raise energy taxation. In many emerging markets, where revenues are still low in percent of GDP, there will be a need to mobilize revenues, to increase revenues, including by fighting tax evasion. In Europe, where taxes are already high, more would be needed on the spending side. But even in Europe, as I mentioned, in most cases it will be a matter of freezing spending in real terms rather than cutting spending. And for all countries, reforms are needed in the pension and healthcare system, given their trend increase over the next decade. In conclusion, public debt has reached in advanced economies unprecedented levels and remains high also in some emerging economies where it has recently been rising. It is a problem that needs to be taken care of, and I argue that it can be done without disrupting the pace of economic growth, which remains fairly weak in parts of the world. In 2016, the IMF is projecting growth rates of the real economy which are not spectacular, so we need to keep in mind this, but we can reduce the amount of public debt without disrupting this process of growth. And however, it is a problem that cannot be ignored either. It can be solved, but it cannot be ignored. It will not go away unless there is a will to address it. So I'll stop at this point. The only thing that I need to do is to thank you for your attention. Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions if there are any questions. Yes, there is. So can you speak up? There is a microphone coming. Okay.
Hello. How do you evaluate the clients before sanctioning a loan? This is question number 1. Question 2 is, what are the conditions, usual conditions given by IMF? And third is, how do you generate your own funds?
Sorry, I couldn't understand. Can you repeat again?
First question. How do you evaluate the clients before sanctioning any loan?
I don't evaluate what?
Clients.
Clients?
Clients, that is, who is going for the lending money from you?
The clients of a loan. Okay, but it's not much in it. Okay. Yes?
How do you evaluate? The second one is, what are the conditions given by IMF?
Yes.
And third one, how do you generate your fund?
How do I generate?
Your own fund.
My own fund? What do you mean by my own fund?
IMF funds.
Oh, the IMF funds?
Yeah.
Not my own, the IMF. Okay, I'll start with the last one. The IMF is financed by its members. There are 188 countries that are members of the IMF. And it's like a society where everybody puts its own contribution. We call them quotas, and that's the main form of financing for the IMF. The second form of financing is that the IMF can borrow from countries, and it has borrowed quite a lot in the last few years to finance its lending. The IMF does not borrow from financial markets. It could potentially, in theory, borrow from financial market, but it has never done it. Maybe it will do it in the future, but so far there was never the need to borrow from financial markets. The conditions of IMF lending, you were asking. The IMF lends, there are two types of conditions. One, those that relate to the interest that a country has to pay to borrow from the IMF. At present, the IMF lends at an interest rate that is it is linked to the interest rate in the world, but the interest rates in the world are very low, and the mechanism is that there are 100 basis points over the market interest rate, which, however, at the moment is practically zero. So for most countries that borrow from the IMF, they borrow at an interest rate of 1% at the moment. If you borrow a lot, you have surcharges. So if you borrow more than 300% of your quota at the IMF, or your injection of capital to the IMF, then you pay a surcharge which is equal to 300 basis points. So a country like Portugal, that has borrowed quite a lot from the IMF, at the moment is paying about 4% to the IMF, plus there are some surcharge, other small things, but most of it is, at the moment, is about 4% for a country like Portugal. The IMF, there are other conditions that are relevant for the IMF, in the sense that the IMF lends on the condition that countries, they try to fix the problems that originated the economic problem that forced them to come to the IMF to borrow. These are conditions that relate to the economic policies that are implemented by countries. So if a country ran into problems because it had a public sector deficit or a public sector debt that was too high, the IMF requires as a condition for its lending that the government tightens its fiscal policy. So this is what the IMF calls conditionality. The other question is when you refer how you select the clients of a loan. Were you referring to the IMF loans? Well, it's not that the IMF selects the clients. The clients come to the IMF when they are in trouble. At that point, the IMF can decide to lend or not to lend, and that is based on on whether the country is willing to fix its economic policies, basically. There are some countries that would like to have a program and they would like to borrow from the IMF, and they cannot do it simply because they are not willing to do the things that the IMF believes are necessary to fix the problem. Now, sometimes this is not nice because there is a country that is in need of borrowing, the IMF says no. But the problem is that we need to make sure that the problem is fixed because the IMF, which is the international community basically, needs to be repaid. So that's basically why there is a conditionality. According to the IMF statute, why there is conditionality in IMF lending. The evaluation of India given by IMF is quite positive at the moment. By the way, India several years ago did borrow money from the IMF, but I think we need to go back something like 20 years. India is growing quite a lot at the moment. It's a positive thing. It is reducing its vulnerabilities related, for example, to a level of public debt that it is high. As I showed you, among the 10 countries with the largest debt to GDP ratio, India was the one that managed to reduce its public debt more rapidly. India also has something else that allows it to run a relatively larger public debt to GDP ratio. Namely the fact that the financial sector is still constrained, and so it becomes more difficult to bet against public debt in India. So altogether, the assessment that is given by the IMF to Indian economic policy is quite positive at the moment. Yes, question.
Sir? Sir, I have a question.
Microphone there?
Sir, here.
No, sorry, there is another one there, sorry.
Sir, if Greece breaks off from the Eurozone and doesn't abide by the austerity measures given by the IMF, what are the measures taken by IMF to realize its sovereign debt?
What are the measures taken by the IMF to?
Sir, if Greece doesn't abide by the austerity measures provided by the IMF.
Oh, I don't understand. Sorry, maybe. What are the measures taken by the IMF to do what?
To realize its debt given by IMF to Greece.
To Greece. Okay, the situation of Greece is quite complicated in the sense that Greece, the IMF has been involved in Greece for several years. Since 2010, Greece had to come to the IMF because of its large public sector deficit, which had reached 15% of GDP, its high its high current account deficit, so its imbalance between export and imports, which also exceeded 10% of GDP, which also had reached 1.15% of GDP. So the country had to come to the IMF. There was a first program that did not end up very well for a number of reasons. Personally, I believe that, you see, the IMF was not the only country, not only the only financer of Greece. Greece was also financed by the European Union. In my view, it was getting lending from the European Union at interest rates that were just too high. In addition, some governments started talking about the need to restructure public debt. Markets became scared. The first program did not end up very well. The second program that was started at the end of 2011 and did involve a debt restructuring from the beginning, debt towards the private sector, was working better. Greece had returned to positive growth at the end of 2013, beginning of 2013, but there was a political crisis. And this created a new program, and so GDP in Greece started declining again in 2015. There has been, as you know, a new government. There is now a third program that is for the moment supported only by the European Union. The IMF has argued that public debt in Greece remains unsustainable, and there is a need for a further restructuring, this time of public debt held by the official sector, by the Europeans. The Europeans said, well, yes, we are willing to reconsider some restructuring, but not a cut in the nominal value of debt. In any case, the discussions of Greece will be resumed after the first review of this issue of public debt restructuring will be looked at after the first review of the program financed by the Europeans, which will happen over the next month, I believe. So at that point, the IMF will have to take a view on whether it wants to go back to resume its lending to Greece, and so have a third program with Greece. So I cannot anticipate how this will end. At the IMF, I'm also representing Greece. At the IMF, at the moment, I'm representing 6 countries. I'm at the board of the IMF representing Italy, Greece, Portugal, Albania, Malta, and this small country, San Marino. And so I'm also representing Greece, although my deputy deals with Greece most of the time because he's from Greece. So, but I cannot anticipate. I hope that there will be a solution, that the IMF will go back to lending to Greece. We'll see how things will go over the next few weeks.
So, what will happen if Greece breaks off the Eurozone? The Eurozone disintegrates.
If Greece?
If Greece breaks off the Eurozone, it doesn't maintain...
No, I don't think, I mean, Greece has restated its willingness to stay in the Eurozone during the course of 2015. If there was a risk, that was the moment. The fact that even at that point Greece restated its willingness to stay in the Euro area will show you that I don't think that now the risk of an exit is very large. On the other side, Greece has accepted the conditions that are required by the European partners to fix its economic problems. So I don't see now this possible, and indeed, financial markets don't talk about Grexit, so the exit of Greece is called Grexit. They don't talk about this anymore, so the situation seems to be quiet at the moment from that point of view. And indeed, it's surprising, and it has been noted by Mario Draghi, the chairman of the European Central Bank. He has recently noticed how much things have changed with respect to 1 year or even only 7 or 8 months ago, when the focus of all financial markets was on Greece, while now nobody talks about Greece anymore.
Thank you, sir.
Sir? So you have spoken about public debt in detail. So my question is regarding the private debt. So if we include the private debt in the analysis, then the picture might change. Picture might change a lot. Like China will may come at somewhere near the top. So what do you think that if we include the private debt also in comparison to public debt, what will be the situation? And how much relative importance is it there? I mean, of private debt?
Yeah, no, private debt is also a possible cause of problems. There is no doubt about it. Indeed, when in 2011 and 2012, Italy was hit by a speculative attack, people were not buying government paper, the Italian government was very underscored that private debt in Italy is very low. And so, in a way, they were saying, look, looking only at public debt is not sufficient. You also need to look at private debt. At private debt, our private debt is low. And the problem is that, although in principle private debt is also very important, a country that has high public debt can get into trouble even if private debt is low. And a good example is indeed my country in 2011 and 12. In other words, it's better to have, if you have a car and you have a wheel that doesn't work, it's bad. If you have two wheels that don't work, it's even worse. It's better to have one flat tire than two flat tires. But I'm saying that even only with flat tires we are in trouble. Even if private debt is low and you just have too much public debt, you may get into trouble. Again, of course, it's better if at least private debt is low. Many countries got into trouble because of private debt being too high.
So, question somewhat different from him and more related to that person's. You talked about austerity measures, but there is a lot of debate going on where people who are on the left-leaning economists like Stiglitz and Krugman, they are against any sort of austerity measures. So, and also if we look at the structure of Greek economy and other European economies, they are mostly consumption-based economies. And if there is austerity, it's argued that consumption will go down, and what will stimulate economy in that case if austerity fails?
Now, fiscal austerity, I mean, let me step back a bit. 2 or 3 years ago, in 2012, I wrote a short paper arguing that fiscal austerity can be excessive. So there are cases in which trying to cut public spending too rapidly, trying to raise public spending, trying to raise taxation too rapidly in order to lower public debt can be counterproductive. It could even lead, you want to reduce your debt to GDP ratio, so you tighten fiscal policy. In the short run, you may even get an increase in the debt to GDP ratio because GDP declines, GDP drops. I've shown that this can happen, and it can happen especially if your starting debt to GDP ratio is very high. However, this is the short-term effect. Over time, if you tighten fiscal policy, you would have a decline in the debt to GDP ratio, even if initially you have an increase because GDP declines. You may have a more persistent, and the reason why this happens is that you have reduced permanently the deficit, while the impact on GDP is a one-off effect. This said, there may be situations in which austerity has, you get into a vicious circle. You tighten fiscal policy. Initially, the debt to GDP, initially GDP declines, the debt to GDP ratio goes up. If at that point markets are nervous and they are focused on the short term, then interest rates on public debt may go up, and then the whole process may be derailed. So I think that too much austerity is a problem. At the same time, not to have any austerity may also be a problem, for the reason that I explained earlier. The problem cannot be cured simply, high public debt, the problem cannot be cured simply by high growth. if you are not willing to save something, because then you just work, you have the effect of the denominator, and that operates very slowly. But I agree, too much austerity is a problem.
Good evening, sir. My question to you is that being a law student, we had the honors of scrutinizing one of these strategies proposed by you, which was the three-pillar strategy of consolidation. Having established that India is an emerging economy and there is a high need of balancing the GDP, would you agree with me when I say that as the third pillar, which was the increasing revenues to increase the efficiency, it might pose as a challenge for the emerging economy? This is my first question.
Yes. Then you can ask perhaps another question. Well, let me answer you this question. What I mentioned, revenue mobilization, is a very important issue for emerging economies. Revenue mobilization is a term that we use to say increasing the revenue to GDP ratio. The revenue to GDP ratio is very low in many emerging economies, and even more in low-income economies. Now, these countries need public spending for a number of reasons, including for infrastructure. So there is a need for those countries to raise revenues, and one key way to do it is to fight tax evasion, which is typically very high in emerging economies. There are many areas in the world where not enough is done in this area. As one of the things that I did at the IMF was to be the head of the Fiscal Affairs Department, and my department had two whole divisions dealing with fighting tax evasion. And they were mostly providing, so it was about 45, 50 economists, specialists of tax evasion, and we were providing we had about 100 missions every year to countries that wanted to improve their tax administration system to reduce tax evasion. So that's definitely a very important thing to do in emerging economies. So you had a second question?
So in the same paper, in the later part of that paper, you said that demography poses a major challenge, a major fiscal challenge. If you can throw some light on that.
But, no, democracy definitely is something good, so we want to keep it. I don't know, I'm not aware. There are different studies that look at the relationship between democracy and growth. I'm not sure there are many fiscal studies that look at the relationship between democracy and fiscal fiscal performance.
Demography.
Sorry?
Demography.
Ah, demographic. I guess you said demographic. Okay, demographic. No, then it's a different story. Demographic is a lot of work has been done in the relation between demographic and fiscal policy and fiscal trends. I showed you some of this. There is definitely an impact on the fiscal accounts of population aging. That has been proved very well, and the numbers are staggering. That relates to the pure effect of the aging of the population. There is less work done on of an impact that is indirect, the relationship between demographics, per capita income, and fiscal revenues. I believe that per capita income, not only total income, which is obvious, but also per capita income may be affected by population aging, simply because a younger population is more dynamic than a population where the average age is high, like Italy or Japan. Maybe that's a key reason why those countries don't grow much. But this has been much less studied, and so also the impact on the fiscal accounts is also less studied. Let me also mention one more thing. A lot of the impact that I showed you before coming from increase on the fiscal accounts coming from pension and healthcare system, a lot of this, I simplified a bit, has nothing to do with demographics. It had to do with technical progress, and this is important in this place for a technological institute like this. For some reason, over the last 2 decades, technological progress has been both a blessing but also a curse for healthcare. It has been obviously a blessing because technological progress is saving lives, obviously. It makes everybody's life better. For the fiscal accounts, unlike other sectors where technological progress involves savings for the public sector, in the healthcare sector, technology comes with a very high price. So we have now technologies in the healthcare sector that are much better than 20, 30, 40 years ago, but are also much more expensive. And so people project this effect of the technological progress in the healthcare sector ahead, and they get those very large increases in projecting healthcare spending. The good news is that for some reason, over the last 3, 4, 5 years, in many countries, the increase in the healthcare to GDP ratio has been very modest. Starting in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and the last decade, the healthcare spending to GDP ratio has increased enormously in a number of countries, including the United States. Now that it has sort of stopped. So maybe now we see the effect of technological progress in the healthcare sector also on the cost of healthcare. We'll see in the future.